Hello, welcome to State of Our Workforce Unpacked, where we'll dig deeper into the incredibly impactful work of our network partners and what they're doing across the country. My name is Henry Danner, and I'm the Manager of Network Engagement at the National Fund. Today, I'm joined by Judith Smith, Director of New York City Workforce Funders Collaborative, Lauren Melodia, the Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, and Audrey Jenkins, a research associate also from the Center for New York City Affairs. Together, we're going to unpack their strategy to increase access to middle wage jobs and upskilling opportunities for low wage workers in New York City. We'll also touch on how this shift can help to address New York City's affordability crisis. How you all doing today?
Great. Doing good.
That's good. That's good. I had the luxury of attending a convening you hosted recently where you unveiled the strategy. So I heard a little bit about it. So I'm happy to get our listeners to learn a little bit about it as well. And I should mention, Judith knows this. I don't know if you know this, Audrey and Lauren. I am a native New Yorker, so this episode is very special to me to highlight the work that you all are doing in my city. So thanks for joining us. So I learned a lot at the event, and like I said, we want to share that with our listeners. So we're going to start with you, Judith. Right, your collaborative recently launched this strategic plan that focuses on increasing access to middle wage occupations and upskilling opportunities for low wage workers. Tell us a little bit about what led you to making this a priority, and what are the first steps that you plan to take under your new strategy?
Thanks, Henry. It's great to be here, by the way, and just really want to thank you for lifting up this work and having us here today. So this new strategy is really a response to our local context. New York City's deep affordability challenges, increasing poverty and financial hardship, and a rapidly shifting labor market. We have quite a complex, robust workforce system or ecosystem here, and it's working on a very large scale. Tens of thousands of people are connected to jobs each year, but typically these are entry-level, low-wage jobs. And we think that's a critical starting point, but it doesn't cover the cost of living in New York City. And we know this is really the reality elsewhere. Affordability is a national issue. Low-wage jobs make up a greater and greater share of the labor market in most places. And if we're honest, our workforce systems are a pipeline to those jobs. You may have seen, I'm sure our colleagues in other regions have seen some recent reporting. For example, the Century Foundation looked at WIOA-funded programs, the outcomes of those programs, and saw that they really didn't have an impact on economic mobility and sustained wage growth. And we think that should be, economic mobility really should be the end goal of our systems. Mm-hmm. We also want to recognize some important local work that influenced us. So in recent years, during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, our collaborative made some investments in improving the quality of low-wage jobs. We looked at several workforces. We looked at frontline healthcare, childcare, and social services workforces, and really it was inspired by the research that the Center for New York City Affairs, Lauren and Audrey and other colleagues produced that really helped us see how much of our local labor market was kind of focused on these low-wage jobs. And we think that work to make those jobs better is essential. It's important to the National Fund, I know, to all of our colleagues across the country. But in a place like New York City with such a high cost of living, we've got to focus on strategies that really target those higher paying middle wage jobs. Yeah. And coming out of the pandemic, again, we have really important work in New York City to understand poverty, to measure poverty. So the Center for New York City Affairs, again, I will lift up their really important work to understand poverty. Also, Robin Hood Foundation and Columbia University have been tracking poverty through a poverty tracker. It's a great resource. And there have been some important frameworks to understand what is the cost of living in New York City. So I'll lift up the United Way of New York City created a true cost of living framework, and also they are using the Alice framework, and these are so critical and really influenced us, but they haven't yet translated to a citywide workforce development strategy. And that's the gap we're really trying to fill. So to move this work forward, we need to define what income range we're talking about, whether we use the words middle wage or not. These kind of higher paying jobs that are tied to economic mobility. And so our first step is to work with Lauren and Audrey and the Center for New York City Affairs. They're here today to actually share about this work that they're doing for us. This is really the first step to define this income range that's higher paying middle wage. We're also, as a next step, going to be working with Burning Glass Institute to identify accessible middle wage occupations in New York City, those that are projected to grow and those that are resilient to AI. We're also going to look at our landscape of pathways to understand what's aligned. And then we can't forget about policy. The last piece is also to think about policy recommendations that improve low wage jobs, but also increase the share of higher wage jobs.
Got your work cut out for you.
Yeah.
But that is really critical to understanding how to make the city more affordable. Everything you just stated. And what struck me the most about your strategy was the words middle wage income, because I've seen it before, but I could never say I could put my thumb on knowing what that is, right? So Audrey, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that. I know you worked on coming up with a framework to define middle wage income and what that means in New York City specifically. So I know you're going to be targeting occupations in that income range, as Judith just said. So can you just tell us about your analysis and how you landed on what is the income range and how you landed on that?
Yeah, thank you, Henry. So as Judith said, Lauren and I took the task of trying to define that range, and we approached this goal by defining a middle wage based on economic literature around living wages and wage quality. And for context, economists generally think of the term middle as kind of referring to middle of the wage distribution, so like the median hourly wage. And in New York, that median wage is $27 an hour, or $56,000 a year if working full time. And the issue with using the median wage is that it doesn't necessarily take into account what that wage can afford in terms of the wage earner's ability to pay for things in their local context. So multiple reports have come out recently showing that a vast majority of New Yorkers are not really able to afford basic costs of living right now. So even looking at really, really basic costs like the Urban Institute recently did with their true costs of living, 50% of New Yorkers in the city were not able to afford those basic costs. And that goes up among certain groups, like among Latinx households and families with children. It was closer to 65%. So we took inspiration from a professor at the New School, Dr. David Howell, who's been drawing on living wage and quality wage literature to analyze wages at a national level based on quality of life that the wages can afford. And he defines a specific slice of the wage distribution looking at the lower bound that can cover basic costs of living. So this would be the living wages, and then an upper bound that's at 150% of that to cover more than basic needs. So providing more of like a middle class quality of life. And so our approach was to follow that same lower bound set by kind of like basic needs for single adults. And then instead of using 150, we defined the upper bound using kind of modest middle class expenses that most New York families might want to be able to afford on top of those basic needs. Yeah. And then this allowed us to define a relatively narrow range to support the target, the industry analysis for this project. And also sets like an entry point, right? Like Judith was saying, for middle wage jobs that can really afford what people want to be able to pay for and what, most of us want to enjoy in our lives every day. So we looked at the cost of living calculators that could help us get a sense of what New Yorkers have to pay for. So this would be like the basic needs.
Mhm.
And there's two big ones that Dr. Howell was using, which is the MIT Living Wage Institute and the EPI Family Budget. And then there's another calculator, the Self-Sufficiency Standard from the Center of Women's Welfare at University of Washington. This calculator was actually used by an institute, United Way, as Judith mentioned them already, to estimate true cost of living in New York City specifically. And then the Urban Institute also did their own analysis as well, where they added on top of basic needs the ability to weather economic hardship. So they looked at the true cost of economic security. We moved forward with the United Way's calculator because it had a number of advantages. One of those being that they really narrowed in on like the different costs in different neighborhoods, like really high dense and expensive neighborhoods, so that they were able to account for the diversity across the city geographically. And then they also have a very wide range of family types to draw from to understand, based on a family composition, what are wages actually covering. So when you look at New York City family composition, which we looked at using census data, 24% of working age adults 18 to 64 are single adults, and then 46% are in 2-adult households, half of which have children and half that don't. And then there's 23% of households that are like 3-adult households that don't have children. And 6% of working age adults are single parents. So it's a small slice, but these are families with like extraordinarily higher expenses compared to the others for one wage to cover. But this family composition analysis let us understand what the most common expenses were and helped us set the floor, so getting to our wage range, at $28.74 an hour. So that's based on the true cost of living for a single adult. And then we adjusted that floor by taking those middle class expenses on top of this. And when we looked at cultural activities, so what people might want to be able to pay for to just enjoy life day to day. So not just basic needs, but being able to travel, entertainment, meals out, things that we all want to take advantage of. We added those expenses. We looked at savings for the future. So that analysis from the Urban Institute about the true cost of economic security was very important in helping us understand how people can save to really build that security. Then we also thought about people wanting to save to expand their families, costs they may face for extended family expenses, debt, and then we added, of course, tax. So this was like a model that we developed on top of it. And all of these we kind of, we assume like a basic, like a modest kind of expense, and assume that families will adjust based on their circumstances, their needs. So when looking at that, we set the upper bound at $40.65. So this gives us a wage range of around $60K to $85K annually. And that helps cover single adults and 2-parent households that might have a school-age child and a child in pre-K. Which we think is important because younger children's expenses are one of the bigger expenses, like childcare expenses, that families have to cover. And so this wage range right now, about 18% of workers fall into that wage range, 52% fall below, and 30% fall above. And then, of course, thinking about those families with children who have a single wage that they have to pay for on top of everything else they have to pay for. It's a single wage that they're having to try to shoulder all of their expenses onto. We think there's an additional conversation around trying to make the city more affordable. But when you look at the kind of like gap that the Urban Institute looked at, there was about 50K to 55K resource gap among families with children. This wage range does help cover that expense gap. So we're happy to see that the analyses kind of line up, and that this would really be able to help families afford a much more comfortable lifestyle in the city. And of course, the goal is to move people who are currently in that 52, that lower below the wage range, up into this this middle wage range. So it would significantly increase the resources that they have to cover their expenses and also enjoy a higher quality of life in the city.
Audrey, thank you. That I know that took a lot of work, and you was able to make it sound so simple, but it took a lot of work to figure that out. And I love how robust your framework is and everything that you incorporated. And I want to emphasize the incorporating of like not just basic living needs and just surviving in New York City, like people being able to enjoy the city that they live in, which is like one of the main reasons that people love being in New York City. So I love that you all figured out a way to incorporate that into your framework, into the range that you want to move people into. So those quality of life things that make the city more or less affordable being a priority is super cool. And you know, affordability is a word that we have just seen dominate the news headlines lately. It was a major focus during the recent mayoral campaign. And we know that along with issues such as food insecurity, the cost of childcare and housing, wages are one of the key components that affect people's ability to be able to make ends meet. So, Lauren, I'm going to toss it over to you to talk a little bit about what are the policies that are most critical for helping low wage workers advance in New York City?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I mean, I think when people hear conversation around affordability, you know, during the mayoral election season and truthfully the last couple of years, there's really been a focus on the cost of things like food, housing, and childcare, and a sense that no one can afford these things in New York or in the U.S. economy these days. So, you know, it's been interesting to think about how policymakers can try to contain some of these costs. And it opens up a real conversation about how we as a society and city guarantee people have a good quality of life and whose responsibility those costs are. You know, are they the responsibility of your employer? Are they the responsibility of the city at large? Are they things that should be provisioned by the government? You know, I think there's a lot of questions that are being opened up right now around those that are really exciting and interesting. But, you know, it's also important to acknowledge that the affordability crisis is different depending on if you have a job and how much it pays.
Right.
And the ways that this interacts with existing policy, because there are many New Yorkers who have low wage jobs now or no jobs at all, who depend on things like SNAP, you know, food stamps, Medicaid, the Child Care Assistance Program vouchers. And so reducing the cost of food is certainly desirable, or the cost of childcare, but it's also important to make sure that people have jobs that can cover the cost of food to begin with, you know, so that you're no longer relying on food stamps. And it's also important to protect programs like SNAP and Medicaid, which have really been eroded in the past year by the Trump administration and Congress's passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So I think there's all of these things to kind of consider when thinking about affordability. You know, there are certainly the cost side, and then there's the ability of, you know, policymakers to help raise wages for people. When we looked at the income distribution of where New Yorkers fall in New York City right now, 55% of New York City workers earn $25 per hour or less. That's below the median. And it's way below the threshold that we're trying to establish as like the lower bound for what it costs to live here in the city and afford a good life here. And so I think there's a couple of things that local policymakers can certainly do. You know, one is examining what incentives the city already has in place to retain and recruit businesses. We should be looking at, you know, making sure that these businesses aren't just creating jobs, but are creating jobs that cover the cost of living in New York City. That should be the responsibility of employers. If you're working full-time, you should be able to afford to live in the city.
Right.
There's also, you know, making sure that, you know, many of the jobs that are low income in the city are better jobs. And I think that this is an area where the city can really pave the way and demonstrate that they hold this threshold in, you know, as their baseline. there are a lot of minimum wage jobs in the city government now, but also ones that the city contracts with nonprofits across the city. I think childcare is a perfect example of this. This is one of the lowest paid jobs in society. If we want to make sure that childcare is affordable for parents, we also have to make sure that those childcare jobs the city is creating or absorbing the costs of are jobs that also cover that worker's quality of life here in the city. And I think, one of the things that's really interesting right now, we've had several snowstorms in the city, and the city's got this emergency snow shovelers program right now, where the starting rate is $19.14 an hour. But after working 40 hours in 1 week, your wage grows to $28.71 per hour, which is basically, the cost of living for a single person, according to the United Way cost of living calculator, or the lower bound that we've created in this threshold. So, that's something like the city is trying to make an effort in that position to demonstrate we are considering the cost of living. And we just need to make sure that the city uses its own resources to make that broader across all of its contracts and city employment, to set some standards here, as an employer, and also with the employers that it's bringing into the city and attracting.
Thank you, Lauren. I love that highlight of that snow shovelers example. There's actively a blizzard going on in New York City, so I think it's very relevant. So we're going to transition and kind of close out. And Judith, I'm going to circle back to you for our last question. Okay. So at the National Fund, career navigation is one of our core focus areas. We understand that transforming the systems that prepare workers for career advancement is a huge key to economic mobility. So just looking into the future and into your crystal ball, if everything works out according to your strategic plan, how will your focus on middle wage occupations and wages, upskilling, how's that going to redefine the way that workers are prepared for upward mobility in New York City?
Very good question. The first layer is that our hope is this translates into a citywide strategy for moving lower income folks from survival jobs to real economic mobility. But we think there are structural implications, major structural implications for the workforce ecosystem, in that for it to work, there will need to be an expansion or even a reorientation of our systems, toward those higher paying middle wage occupations as an explicit goal. And that means more investment in advancement beyond just that, getting that first entry level survival job, real investment in what it takes to advance these same workers. And lastly, I think for it to work, really, it will require greater connectivity between the different parts of this very complex ecosystem. So that would be the public workforce agencies, a very large field of nonprofits here, our community colleges, labor unions, and industry partnerships.
Thank you. And I really am going to be glued to your strategic plan and just like keeping up with the updates and as you go through your phases, because I think it is very well laid out and well thought out. And I'm just looking forward to seeing some changes in New York City. So thank you, Judith. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Audrey, for joining us. It was really great to learn about the work that you all are doing. And I'm very proud of you all and proud to be a New Yorker when I hear when I'm involved in these type of conversations, especially. So I want to thank everybody that joined us on LinkedIn as well. And please be sure to follow the National Fund and stay up to date with the latest from State of Our Workforce, and tune into future episodes where we're going to explore the future of workforce equity with our network partners on State of Our Workforce Unpacked. Until then, take care, everybody.